I want to tell you about the night my life's work was systematically stolen from me. I was 27 years old. I had spent 3 grueling years staring at high-resolution blue screens, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, writing the foundational core of a software that was about to revolutionize the global cybersecurity industry. The architecture, the algorithms, the database structures, every single line created by me, in the complete isolation of my home office while the world slept. And at exactly 11:42 on a rainy Tuesday night, just 14 hours before we were scheduled to present our final live demo to Silicon Valley's most powerful venture capital firm, my laptop pinged. It wasn't a standard notification. It was an automated, high-priority security alert from the private, off-grid server I maintained in our house. Someone was downloading the master encryption keys. The login credentials used belonged to my husband, David, but the IP address tracking system showed a location that wasn't his downtown office. It was a private, multi-million-dollar beach house in Malibu, a house owned by my absolute best friend and business partner, Elena. Here's what happened next. My name is Victoria Sterling. I am 27 years old. I am a software engineer, a data architect, and a system designer. If you met me at a local coffee shop in Palo Alto, you probably wouldn't look twice. I don't wear haute couture, I don't care about the social dynamics of the valley, and I don't buy things to prove my worth. I care about clean logic. I care about closed systems that run without errors. I grew up in Austin, Texas, raised by a brilliant but quiet single father who spent his life repairing old IBM mainframes in a dusty basement. He taught me a lesson that became the anchor of my life. The world is not run by people's opinions. It is run by invisible numbers, and if you know how to read the logs, nobody can ever truly lie to you. I met David 5 years ago at a massive tech conference in San Francisco. He didn't know the difference between Python and C++, but he knew how to talk to people. He had that smooth, effortless, Ivy League charm that instantly disarms a room. He was tall, had perfectly styled sandy hair, and wore tailored Italian suits that made him look like he had been born to negotiate multi-million-dollar buyouts. When we fell in love, it felt like the perfect optimization algorithm. I was the silent brain operating behind the scenes. He was the public voice operating under the spotlight. We were perfect, or so the model suggested. 3 years ago, I came up with an idea for a revolutionary data encryption matrix. We decided to launch Aegis Tech. But a tech startup cannot survive on code alone. It needs marketing, branding, and global scale. That was the moment David suggested bringing in Elena. Elena had been my closest friend since our freshman year at Stanford. She was stunning, tall, athletic, blonde, with an electric, dominant energy that commanded attention the second she stepped into any room. She was a marketing prodigy. When the three of us incorporated Aegis Tech, we divided the equity based on a verbal trust that I now realize was a suicide pact. 40% for me as the sole creator and engineer, 30% for David as CEO, and 30% for Elena as Chief Marketing Officer. For the first 18 months, we operated from a cramped, poorly ventilated garage in Palo Alto. I remembered those days with a strange kind of nostalgia. My back ached, my eyes were constantly bloodshot, and I survived on cold takeout. But while I was buried in the terminal, David and Elena were always out. They were pitching to angel investors, taking enterprise clients to high-end dinners, and building the corporate brand. Slowly, the lifestyle shifted. We moved out of the garage into a massive tech-chic office. David bought a luxury German vehicle. Elena leased a private beach house in Malibu for client entertainment. I didn't care about the money being spent. I only cared that the system was growing.
I never questioned why David started coming home at 3 a.m. smelling faintly of high-end single malt scotch and ocean air. I never questioned why Alina's corporate expense reports included thousands of dollars for weekend strategy retreats in Malibu where no engineers were invited. I trusted them with a blindness that defies logic. David was the man who held my hand at night. Elena was the woman who had lived with me through every major event of my 20s. They weren't just my partners, they were my entire world. The final, definitive demo for our software was scheduled on a Wednesday morning. Davenport Capital, the largest venture fund in California, was prepared to value Aegis Tech at $20 million based on our preliminary papers. On Tuesday night, David walked into my home office. He leaned down, kissed my forehead, and smoothed my hair. He said, "I have to stay late at the downtown headquarters tonight, Vic. Elena and I need to run through the financial presentation decks one last time before the board meeting. Don't wait up for me, okay? Get some rest. Tomorrow is our big day." I said, "Good luck." I told him, I looked into his eyes, and I genuinely meant it. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted us to succeed. He walked out the door at 8 p.m. By 11 p.m., the house was dead silent. A heavy California rain was beating against the glass windows of our living room. I was sitting at my triple-monitor desk, running final optimization diagnostics on our security matrix. I wanted everything to be flawless for the investors. And then, at exactly 11:42 p.m., the secondary terminal, the one connected to my private, unlisted server, flashed a violent, pulsing crimson. Warning, master encryption key export initiated.
I did not cry. I didn't scream. I didn't drop my coffee cup. And my heart rate didn't even spike. When you are a developer and a system reports a critical, catastrophic breach, emotional panic is a luxury that costs you the entire system. You don't cry at a terminal. You isolate the leak, you track the packets, and you identify the source of the infection. David and Alina thought they were executing a masterful, high-stakes corporate heist. They forgot that while David knew how to pitch a product and Alina knew how to label it, I was the one who built the digital reality they were standing on. They wanted my source code. They wanted the keys to the kingdom. I was about to give it to them. But it wasn't going to make them rich. It was going to destroy them completely. I bypassed the standard security protocols and began tracing the digital footprint of the intrusion. The user credentials used to log into the master vault belonged to David, his high-level administrative account. But the packet routing didn't originate from our downtown corporate office. The network hops led straight to a residential fiber line in Malibu. I pulled up David's phone location data on my side monitor. It was a native tracking system we had mirrored years ago when we first got married. He had likely forgotten it even existed, buried deep within his device's root settings. The glowing blue dot was completely stationary. It was sitting directly inside Elena's luxury beach house. My hands moved across the mechanical keyboard with a cold, rhythmic precision. I initialized a remote diagnostics tool on David's company laptop, which he had connected to our network. Using a hidden administrative backdoor I always leave in my software architecture for emergency maintenance, I quietly turned on the laptop's integrated camera and ambient microphone. A video window rendered on my screen. The feed showed the interior of Elena's living room. It was stunning. White linen sofas, expansive glass walls looking out at the dark, rainy Pacific Ocean, and modern art pieces on the walls. David was sitting on the sofa, his tie loosened, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. Elena was sitting right next to him, her legs curled up, wearing a silk robe. On the marble coffee table between them sat an external SSD drive, glowing with a steady blue light as it ingested gigabytes of my data. "It's at 90%, David said, his voice carrying a smug, arrogant laugh through my headphones.
The entire architecture is downloading. Tomorrow morning, once we sign the standard pre-investment disclosure with Davenport, Victoria's technical leverage disappears. Elena leaned over, resting her head on his shoulder, her blonde hair catching the ambient light of the room. Are you sure the Delaware LLC is completely protected, David? If her lawyers audit the corporate structure after the buyout, she might find the intellectual property transfer. She won't find anything, David sneered, taking a sip of his drink. Victoria doesn't look at corporate filings. She sits in her dark room, stares at brackets and semicolons, and trusts whatever document I put in front of her. By the time she realizes the core patent has been transferred to our joint entity in Delaware, Aegis Tech will be an empty shell, and we'll be holding the capital. Elena laughed, a soft, melodic sound that I had listened to for 10 years of my life. She really is a genius when it comes to systems, David, but she's completely blind when it comes to you. I sat in my chair completely frozen, watching the live feed of my husband and my best friend finalizing the liquidation of my existence. The sheer scale of the deception was magnificent. It wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a cold, calculated months-long execution. They had used my intellect to build a fortress, and now they were locking me outside of it. I didn't close the window. I watched until the download reached 100%. I watched David unplug the drive, slip it into his pocket, and kiss her. Then I turned off the feed. The time was 12:34 a.m. I had less than 10 hours before the venture capital meeting. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't call the police. Instead, I opened a blank development environment. My fingers flew across the keys for the next 4 hours. I didn't write an encryption patch. I wrote a mirror algorithm, a specific piece of software disguised as a core system update, tied directly to David's administrative user profile. If he connected that external drive to any machine, or if he accessed their Delaware bank accounts, my software would automatically mirror every keystroke, every document, and every private communication back to a public, unalterable digital ledger. I uploaded the package. I labeled it as a routine system optimization script. At 4:15 a.m., I heard the front door of our house click open. I closed my monitors, slipped into bed, and feigned a deep sleep. A few minutes later, David crept into the bedroom. He quietly shed his clothes, smelling intensely of expensive alcohol and the distinct floral scent of Elena's perfume. He climbed into bed next to me and placed an arm around my waist. I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, listening to the synchronized breathing of a man who had just sold my life for 30 pieces of silver. The next morning, the sun broke through the California clouds, turning the valley into a bright, glistening landscape of tech wealth. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 7:30 a.m. My face was pale, and there were faint shadows under my green eyes from the lack of sleep. I applied a layer of minimalist makeup, straightened the collar of my dark, structured blazer, and walked out. David was in the kitchen, pouring fresh orange juice, looking vibrant and entirely in control. "Morning, sweetheart," he said with that million-dollar smile. "Big day today. Are you ready to become a tech mogul?" "I've never been more ready, David," I said, taking a sip of my black coffee. An hour later, we arrived at the Silicon Valley headquarters of Davenport Capital. Elena was already there, waiting in the lobby, looking radiant in an immaculate cream-colored designer dress. She hugged me tightly. "We're going to change the world today, Vic," she whispered in my ear. I looked at her, smiled, and said, "Yes, the world is going to look very different by noon."
The executive boardroom of Davenport Capital was situated on the top floor, featuring sweeping panoramic views of the entire tech ecosystem below. The air inside was cool, sterile, and smelled of wealth. The managing partners of the fund, men who controlled billions of dollars of institutional capital, sat across a massive, polished glass conference table. Elena took the lead. She stood at the front of the room, utilizing the massive digital projector screen to run through our marketing metrics, global scale projections, and brand positioning. She was flawless. She spoke with a conviction that made the investors nod in total unison. David stood right behind her, stepping in with his financial models, laying out the valuation curves that justified the $20 million price tag. I sat at the far end of the glass table, my high-end workstation laptop closed, watching the performance. It was beautiful theater. "And now," David said, turning toward the board with an expansive, triumphant gesture, "I'm going to hand the floor over to my brilliant wife and our Chief Technology Officer, Victoria. She will run the live deployment of the Aegis core engine, showing you why our encryption is completely unbreachable." The investors turned their attention to me. I stood up slowly, walked to the head of the table, and connected my laptop to the presentation system via the central hub. But when the projector initialized, it didn't display the sleek, polished marketing interface or the corporate logo of Aegis Tech. Instead, the screen turned a stark, high-contrast black, filled with scrolling rows of neon green terminal logs and system architecture diagrams. The main investor, a sharp-eyed billionaire named Arthur Davenport, narrowed his eyes. "Ms. Sterling, is this the user interface? It looks a bit rudimentary." David's smile froze. He took a half step toward me, his voice lowering to a tense whisper. "Victoria, what are you doing? You plugged in the wrong drive. Pull up the demo environment." "This is the correct environment, David," I said, my voice carrying a flat, absolute resonance that silenced the room. I struck the execute key on my mechanical keyboard. The display split into two massive real-time windows. On the left side, a highly detailed geographic map appeared, showing a blinking blue GPS coordinate locked onto Elena's private Malibu beach house at precisely 11:42 p.m. the previous evening. On the right side, the terminal displayed the master server logs showing David's administrative user account downloading 100% of our core proprietary source code to an external storage device. The boardroom plunged into a suffocating, dead silence. You could hear the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. Elena's hand dropped from the presentation clicker. Her color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost under the fluorescent lights. David's eyes widened in absolute, sheer panic. He lunged forward, reaching for my laptop. "Victoria, close the laptop. There's a system glitch. A virus has corrupted her machine, Arthur. I apologize." "Do not touch my terminal, David," I said, not shifting my gaze from the investors. I pressed the spacebar. The data my husband downloaded last night was what he believed to be our encryption source code. In reality, it was a decoy matrix I deployed 2 weeks ago when I noticed systemic irregularities in our corporate expense accounts. I pointed at the scrolling text on the right monitor. The decoy software contained an automated mirror script. The moment David connected that stolen data to his personal devices at Elena's house, it mapped their entire local network. What you are looking at right now, gentlemen, is the corporate registration of a shadow LLC established in Delaware under the names of David Sterling and Alana Vance. And below it are the bank logs showing $450,000 of Aegis Tech's development capital being funneled into that private account over the last 6 months. Arthur Davenport stood up from his leather chair. His face was a mask of cold corporate fury. He didn't look at David or Elena. He looked directly at his general counsel, sitting at the end of the table. "Call our security team," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "and notify the white-collar crime division of the federal authorities. Lock down the building." David grabbed my arm, his fingers tightening with a force that left immediate red marks through my sleeve.
"You insane bitch," he roared, completely abandoning his Ivy League persona in front of the billionaires. "You just destroyed a $20 million valuation. You destroyed the entire company. You destroyed our life." I pulled my arm back with a sharp, decisive motion, looking up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I didn't destroy the company, David," I whispered, ensuring my voice was low enough to remain a private execution. "I filed for a dissolution of marriage at 8 a.m. this morning, and if you checked your legal notifications before this meeting, you would know that under Section 12 of our corporate bylaws, the clause regarding internal fraud and intellectual property theft, your shares, along with Alina's, have been legally invalidated and reverted to the creator. I am Aegis Tech. You were just the salesman." Elena was leaning against the glass wall, her body shaking as she stared at the screen where her private text messages detailing their plans to leave me with an empty corporate shell and escape to Europe were being read by the most powerful financiers in Silicon Valley. Her entire career, her reputation, and her future vanished in 40 seconds.
The federal investigators arrived 20 minutes later. I watched from the floor-to-ceiling windows as David and Elena were escorted out of the corporate high-rise in handcuffs, their faces shielded from the tech journalists who were already gathering in the courtyard below. The system had compiled. The errors had been removed. But a complete database cleanup takes time, and I wasn't done running the script. Exactly 9 months later, the rainy season returned to Northern California. I was sitting in my brand new executive office in downtown San Francisco, looking over the valuation metrics of my independent firm, Sterling Cyber, which had just crossed a $35 million valuation. My personal assistant walked in, looking uncertain. "Miss Sterling, there is a woman downstairs in the lobby. She doesn't have an appointment, and she looks unwell. She claims she used to be your partner, Elena Vance." I looked at the rain streaking down my office window. I said, "Send her up." And when she walked through that door, I realized that some people don't even know they are completely broken until they look into the eyes of the person who broke them. When the private elevator doors opened, Elena stepped into my office. The transformation was absolute. The immaculate blonde hair was unkempt, tied back with a cheap plastic clip. The designer cream dresses were gone, replaced by an oversized faded gray trench coat that looked like it had been bought at a discount store. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale, stripped of the vibrant, electric confidence that used to define her presence at Stanford. She didn't sit down. She stood near the edge of my minimalist mahogany desk, her hands buried deep within her coat pockets to hide the fact that they were trembling uncontrollably. "Victoria," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its melodic, persuasive edge. "David's legal defense team is entering a final plea agreement next week," she said, a tear finally breaking through her mascara and cutting a dark line down her cheek. "Her lawyers, they've constructed a narrative. They're telling the federal prosecutor that I was the mastermind. They're claiming that I used my marketing position to manipulate David, that I was the one who forced him to download the master encryption keys." I finally looked up from my screen, resting my chin on my laced fingers. "And why is that my concern?" I asked. "Because if the judge accepts his plea, David gets a reduced sentence of 18 months in a low-security facility, and I'm looking at 7 years in a federal penitentiary. Victoria, please, you have the unedited root logs from that night. You have the audio files from the laptop back door. You know he was the one who initiated the download. You know he was the one who pushed for the Delaware transfer from the start." I looked at her for a long, unblinking moment. The silence stretched between us like an uncompiled line of code. "Elena,
I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, measured tone. Do you remember our junior year at Stanford when my father was hospitalized after his stroke and I couldn't afford the tuition balance for the winter quarter? She blinked, caught off guard by the memory. Yes, yes, I remember. I helped you study. No, I replied flatly. You didn't help me study. You took my advanced algorithm notes, submitted them under your own name for the tech grant competition, won a $10,000 prize, and used it to lease your first car, while I worked the night shift at the computer lab to stay enrolled. She took a step back, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Victoria, that was years ago. We were kids. I knew what you did back then, I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. But I chose to overlook it because I valued the concept of our friendship. I thought it was an isolated system error, but human behavior is an iterative process. If a bug exists in the root directory, it will execute the same error every single time the system runs under pressure. She fell to her knees right in front of my desk, her hands gripping the edge of the wood. Please, Victoria, I'm begging you. If I go to prison for 7 years, my life is completely over. I will sign a non-disclosure agreement. I will give up any claim to any tech sector job. I will leave California permanently. Just send the unedited audio logs to my defense lawyer. I stood up from my executive chair. I walked over to the massive glass window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline, shrouded in gray rain and low-hanging fog. The unedited logs have already been delivered to the federal prosecutor, Elena. I sent them months ago. I don't alter data to protect my enemies, and I don't delete data to punish them. I simply allow the system to output the exact result of the parameters you entered. What do you mean? She stammered from the floor. The logs show that David initiated the download, I said, turning my head slightly to look down at her cowering figure. But they also show that you provided the administrative password encryption bypass that allowed him to get through my secondary firewall. You are both equally guilty. You are both equally toxic to my system. And the output code for qualified corporate fraud is federal confinement. Enjoy the execution of your choices. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She slowly stood up from the floor, realized there was absolutely nothing left to exploit, turned around, and walked back into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft, mechanical click. David's appeal was rejected 3 weeks later. He was sentenced to 4.5 years at a medium security correctional facility in Oregon. Elena was sentenced to 3 years. Their names became absolute poison in the tech sector, a permanent compile error in the history of Silicon Valley. Do you know why I'm telling you this story from the comfort of this multi-million-dollar office? Because the world wants you to believe that when the people closest to you commit the ultimate betrayal, you're supposed to break down. They want you to believe that your heart is a fragile structure that shatters permanently when your trust is compromised. But my father taught me better. Your life is an operating system, and sometimes a massive catastrophic system crash is the only way the platform can force a hard reboot. It forces you to wipe the hard drive. It forces you to purge the corrupted users. It forces you to delete the malware that has been draining your power in the background. David and Elena thought they could build a technological empire using my brilliant mind as their silent, invisible foundation. They forgot a fundamental rule of engineering. The architect always holds the master override key. I am Victoria Sterling. The database is clean, the system is optimal, and the future is finally running on my terms.